Good afternoon, good people. I hope this still finds you healthy and not feeling any of the symptoms of the COVID-19. I hope all your families are doing well as well. This is the first lecture on Jesus and the Law, Torah obedience versus Torah denial. I just finished going through your various postings on your pericopes. And some pretty impressive insights in there. There were a few patterns and some problems that I wanted to note right off bat, and it has to do specifically with two of the criteria for determining historical authenticity. First of all, the criterion of dissimilarity can get a little wiggly, kind of like Jell-O sometimes. But what you need to keep in mind is the notion that the question is really whether the portrayal of what Jesus is saying or doing is something that the church is not likely to have, doesn't fit really well with the church's pictures of Jesus that we are aware of. That's part of the nuance to it. The other part is if we are reading something in the Gospel of Luke, for example, and somebody noticed something like this, and the portrayal of Jesus is of Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers in the temple courtyards. That doesn't fit really well with Luke's emphasis on Jesus's innocence, and so again, that particular action would be dissimilar to Luke's Christological interests. So you got to watch that one a little bit, but it does not. One of the things, a couple people went in the wrong direction with that. It does not mean dissimilar from what people would have taught or learned or anything like this in the culture in which Jesus was teaching. That's not the issue. I mean, that's an important issue, but that's not what dissimilarity means. Okay, the second one, and this one really surprised me because I thought I'd been fairly clear about it, but the criterion of multiple attestation, or as Bart Ehrman calls it, the more the better. What this means is that if we've got multiple versions of a particular story about or saying from Jesus that exist in independent documents, or I guess that's right, texts that are independent literarily of each other. So if something is in the triple tradition, those Matthew and Luke are not independent of Mark. If it's a double tradition, Matthew and Luke are not independent of Q. So they've got to be independent traditions. And in a couple places, some people noted that we actually had some parallels, direct parallels, but pretty close sometimes, in some of Paul's writings. Well, we don't have really good grounds for connecting Paul to any of the Gospels, the canonical Gospels. So that would be multiple attestation if it's found in Paul, but also in one or more of the synoptics. But once again, the more the better works fine unless they have some kind of a literary relationship to each other. And if you're still unclear about that, please email me or come visit me during my office hours on Blackboard Collaborate, which, by the way, I've been pretty lonely on those things. So, but you don't have to come join me if you don't want to. I just want to let you know I'm available. Once in a while, I may be a teensy bit late for that because of competing interests, but I am doing my best to let you know when I get back online after it. Okay, what I want to do now is talk about these various pericopes. Most of these are ones that you have covered yourselves, and I'm just going to hit some highlights about them. And by the way, I'm reading from a revised standard version of the Gospel Parallels. This is the one I had in the house. So if there are slight differences between this one and your current version of Throckmorton, don't worry about it. I hope there are no significant differences there. The first pericope I want to talk about, and I'm brief, you'll see on my little background here, the P here stands for a particular pericope, pericope 21 in Throckmorton, Jesus' teachings on the law in Matthew 5. Verse 17, we sometimes we forget that Matthew was in his picture of Jesus as the new Moses. This is almost an apologetic type of function. I may have not described it to you that way before, but he is defending Jesus as Lord, Savior, but specifically with this notion that Jesus provides the best interpretation of the Torah. And so when we see opening verse 17 here in Matthew 5, think not that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. A good question behind us in our minds about who is saying that Jesus is coming to abolish the law and the prophets? Well, conceivably, those might be some of the Jews in Matthew's community. We've got some questions here about whether indeed that could represent Matthew's interests right there in verse 17, which therefore it wouldn't be so historically authentic. On the other hand, we've got an awful lot of material in here that says that Jesus was very much into reinterpreting the law, and so we don't have to write that off too quickly. Verse 18 is a good Jewish faith statement. Till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota. In Greek, it's iota, nor a dot will pass from the law until it's all accomplished. That's what a good Jew would say, and that's consistent with, this would be one of the criteria that has to do with context. Is this consistent with the Palestinian context in which Jesus was living? It sure would be. All right. And verse 19 also, this indeed could be authentic because this is again quite consistent with Judaism's view of the Torah. All right. And Jesus, as a Jew, would certainly be very fond. We know in most cases of the Torah itself. All right. The pericope 22. On this is the teachings on murder. First of all, we ought to point out that Matthew actually does have a section here that's not found in the parallel in Luke, and this is about you've heard it was said to men of old, "You shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment." Something unique there in Matthew's emphasis here, but it certainly is pretty consistent with, certainly with the intention, Jesus's emphasis on the intention of the law. And this is something that would be a little bit different than what we find in some of the Pharisaic interpretations, at least what we know of the Pharisaic interpretations of the Torah at the time of Jesus. In fact, the intention seems to be a big issue for Jesus in many different cases. But one of the reasons we wonder whether this might be historically authentic or not is that this fits so well with Matthew's intention to kind of support the church in the structure of his gospel. Not only does it support a picture of Jesus as the new Moses, but Jesus' emphasis on Peter as the founder of the church, and Matthew remembers the first gospel to use the word ecclesia, church. So this indeed, those opening verses in 21 through 23 could easily be part of Matthew's special concern for keeping peace within the community of faith. All right. In pericope 23, this is very similar. Again, we have a section here that's in Matthew that is not in the others. But again, notice Jesus' emphasis on the intention behind the law. And The good question to ask is which criteria for historical authenticity would this match? It is certainly consistent with the Jewish interpretation of the law. The When we go back to the prophet Jeremiah, who most of you know is my favorite prophet, he and actually Ezekiel as well did put a lot of emphasis on the people's worship of God, and the keeping of the Sabbath and things like this was heartfelt, that it was genuine, and so intention would be very consistent. When Jesus asks about or points to the intention behind keeping the law, that this would be very consistent with what Jeremiah had said. Again, Jesus emphasizing attitude here. So there's some. This is probably historically authentic as well. Jesus' teachings in Pericope 24 on divorce. It certainly, as many of you have pointed out, this really would this has got some pretty strong historic authenticity, because here Jesus really does directly take on the Torah, and it was also said here in Matthew 5:31, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And so notice, I mean, this is there are verses here in I believe it's, oh goodness, where did you find those, Andy? Eddie, let's see. Bother. Anyway, all of a sudden I'm blanking on where we found them, but there is a mention of certificate of divorce, possibly Deuteronomy, and here Jesus is directly challenging that. So don't forget that the earliest the Christians were Jews, and so a direct attack, or at least questioning of the Torah, is a pretty gutsy kind of thing, and certainly wouldn't sit especially well with the early Christians. Of course, but it fits really well with Matthew's picture of Jesus as the reinterpreter of it. But this is pretty gutsy and pretty much a point blank type of attack. So probably has some good historical authenticity to it. All right, that was Pericope 24. Let's see if I missed anything I wanted to say about that. That's a direct challenge to the Mosaic law. Okay, let's go down to Pericope 27. And this is Matthew 5:43 and 48 and parallels. And this exists in the double tradition. We've got nothing from Mark on this. We think this has got some pretty good historical authenticity to it. Yes, it doesn't pass the multiple attestation qualification at all. But remember, something doesn't have to pass every one of those criteria in order to be historically authentic. Obviously, the more criteria it passes, the stronger the case would be. But the Jesus here again is pretty much taking on the Torah when he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." And let's see if I've got a reference here to, this is if you go to Leviticus 19:18. That's what it says, and but Jesus says pretty much the opposite on that. So once again, Jesus' interpretation of the Torah here is pretty rigorous and pretty aggressive in many ways. So we think that there is some good historical weight to this. Let's see, there's something else in here also. But again, remember too, this would serve Matthew's interest in trying to keep peace within the community itself. And let's see if there's some differences in here that I don't want to overlook while I've got just 30 seconds or so left here. Luke has some material in here that Matthew doesn't, although it seems to be pretty much in the spirit of what Matthew was saying. If you salute only your brethren, your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? So it doesn't look like what Luke has added, although he's got sons of the Most High language here in verse 35. So there's some language in here that's a little bit different than what we're used to finding actually in Luke. All right, I'm going to stop now and come back in a second in the sequel to this lecture.